Wuram controlled Seoul's underworld with brutal, unchallenged precision. One text from him could shut down entire city districts. One order could end entire rival bloodlines. But tonight, in his bulletproof penthouse, surrounded by guards, guns, and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, he was on his knees begging. His 3-month-old son Jangho had been screaming non-stop for 11 straight days, and the most powerful man in the city could not make it stop. 5 nannies quit. 7 brands of imported premium formula failed. The top pediatricians in the country all told him his son was perfectly healthy. He was not fine. He was failing to thrive, starved for the gentle, loving connection his grieving, emotionally closed-off father could never give him. And Wuram was completely helpless, until Odette, a black refugee staying at the migrant women's shelter he had long funded as a PR front, did what all his money and power could never do. She held the screaming baby to her chest, hummed a soft lullaby from her home country, and breastfed him until the cries fell silent for the first time in weeks. What Wuram did not know was that saving his son would cost him everything he had spent his life fighting for. His criminal empire, his iron grip of control, and eventually his heart. The digital clock on the wall glowed a ghostly blue, marking 2:47 a.m. Inside the glass tower, the air felt thick and heavy. Wuram paced the length of his living room, his bare feet silent on the cold marble. On his shoulder, Jangho was a small, trembling weight of pure agony. The baby's face was a deep, angry red, and his screams were so sharp they felt like a physical blade cutting through the silence of the penthouse. Wuram looked out at the city lights. He was a man who moved millions of dollars with a nod. He could make his enemies vanish with a single phone call. But right now, he felt like a ghost. He was exhausted. He had not slept in 3 days. His expensive silk shirt was stained with spilled milk and tears. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, were shaking. "The tests are all clear, sir," the pediatrician whispered, his voice trembling. He was the 3rd specialist Wuram had summoned this week. "There is no fever, no infection. He is physically perfect." Wuram turned, his dark eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Perfect? Listen to him. Does that sound perfect to you?" The doctor flinched and looked at the floor. He couldn't meet the gaze of the man who ruled the city's shadows. "Perhaps it is just colic, sir. He might grow out of it." "Get out," Wuram rasped. The doctor didn't wait. He grabbed his bag and fled toward the private elevator. In the kitchen, the 4th nanny stood by the counter. She was an expert with 20 years of experience, but her face was pale. She had tried every rocking technique and every expensive, imported formula. Nothing worked. Jangho rejected everything. He was starving, yet he refused to eat. He was tired, yet he refused to sleep. I cannot do this, Mr. Wu," the woman sobbed, her hands over her ears. "It is like he is grieving. I have never heard a sound so full of pain. I'm sorry." She left without asking for her pay. Wuram was alone. He sat on the floor, leaning his head against the bulletproof window. He held his son close, trying to offer warmth, but Jangho only screamed louder. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, mocking him. For the first time in his life, Wuram realized that all his weapons and all his gold were pieces of junk. They could not fix a broken heart. They could not feed a hungry soul. He looked at the tiny boy in his arms and felt a terrifying wave of fear. He was the King of Seoul, but in this quiet, screaming room, he was just a father watching his son slip away. He had to do something different. He had to go somewhere his world usually ignored. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The rain hit the windshield of the black Bentley like 1,000 tiny bullets. Woo-ram drove through the dark streets of Seoul, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. In the back seat, Jangho was still screaming. The sound was weaker now, a thin and raspy wail that made Woo-ram's heart squeeze with a fear he had never felt before. The baby was running out of strength, and Woo-ram was running out of time. He pushed the car faster, ignoring the red lights. He was heading toward a part of the city he usually only saw from the windows of his high-rise office. His destination was a small, brick building tucked away in a narrow alley. It was a migrant women's shelter. To his accountants, this place was just a line on a balance sheet, a tax write-off, and a way to make his criminal empire look like a helpful charity. He had signed the checks for years, but he had never once stepped inside. As he pulled up to the curb, the streetlights reflected in the deep puddles. The building looked humble and worn, a sharp contrast to the chrome and glass of his penthouse. He killed the engine, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the rain on the roof and his son's heartbreaking cries. Woo-ram climbed out, not caring that his expensive leather shoes were sinking into the mud. He tucked Jangho inside his heavy coat to keep him dry and ran toward the door. He didn't knock. He pounded on the wood with his fist, the sound echoing through the rainy night. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I need help!" A small window in the door slid open. A pair of tired eyes looked out at him, widening when they saw his expensive clothes and the desperate look on his face. The locks turned, and the door opened just enough to let him in. The air inside smelled of laundry soap and warm spices. It was a small, crowded space, but it felt strangely safe. Women in pajamas stood in the hallway, watching the tall, dangerous-looking man with a screaming bundle in his arms. Woo-ram stood in the center of the room, his hair dripping wet, looking like a king who had lost his crown. "My son!" he gasped, holding Jangho out as if the baby were a fragile treasure. "He won't stop. Please! Someone make him stop!" He looked around the room, his eyes searching for an answer. He had spent his whole life making people bow to him, but tonight he was willing to bow to anyone who could save his child. The hallway of the shelter grew quiet as a tall woman stepped forward. She was beautiful, with skin as dark and smooth as polished wood. She wore a bright yellow head wrap that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her eyes were calm, and she did not look afraid of Woo-ram's expensive suit or his angry expression. She looked only at the small, shaking bundle in his arms. "I am Odette," she said. Her voice was steady and soft, like a deep song. Woo-ram stepped toward her, his breath coming in quick gasps. "Help him! My nannies, the doctors, they all said he is fine. But he won't stop. He is starving, but he won't eat." Odette reached out and gently touched Jangho's back. The baby was still wailing, his tiny body stiff with stress. She looked up at Woo-ram, and for the first time in years, the Mafia boss felt like someone was looking right through his mask. "He is not sick," Odette said quietly. "He is lonely. You give him medicine and expensive milk, but he is looking for a heartbeat. He is looking for home." She led Woo-ram into a small, private room at the back of the building. There was a simple rocking chair and a soft rug on the floor. The walls were thin, and the sound of the rain outside was loud, but the room felt peaceful. "I lost my own baby boy 2 weeks ago," Odette whispered, her eyes filling with a brief shadow of pain. "My body is still ready to feed him. Your son, he needs what I have. Not just the milk, but the warmth. Do I have your permission?" Woo-ram stood frozen. In his world, everything was a transaction. You paid for service. You didn't ask for a miracle. But as he looked at Jangho's pale face, he knew he had no other choice. He nodded once, his jaw tight. Odette sat in the rocking chair and took the baby. Her movements were slow and sure. She held Jangho close to her skin and began to hum a low, beautiful melody. As she began to nurse him, something impossible happened. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like a physical weight. Jangho's tiny hands, which had been clenched into tight fists for days, slowly relaxed. He made a small, soft sound, a sigh of pure relief, and began to eat. Wuram watched, his mouth open, as his son finally went still. The tension that had been coiled in the baby's body melted away. Wuram leaned against the wall and slowly slid down until he was sitting on the floor. He put his head in his hands. For 11 days, he had fought a war against a sound he couldn't win. Now, in this tiny room, a woman with nothing had done what his entire empire could not. He looked at Odette, who was looking down at his son with a look of pure, motherly love, and he knew his life would never be the same again. The room was so quiet that Wuram could hear the soft rhythm of Jangho's breathing. For the first time in weeks, the baby was peaceful. He lay in Odette's arms, his face soft and calm. Wuram watched them, feeling a strange mix of relief and confusion. He was a man who believed that every person had a price. He thought money could fix any problem, and right now, he wanted to buy this silence forever. He stood up and reached into his wet coat. He pulled out a thick leather checkbook and a gold pen. His movements were quick and businesslike. He scribbled a number on the paper, a number so large it could buy a mansion in the best part of the city. He tore the check out and held it toward Odette. "This is for you," Wuram said, his voice returning to its usual cold tone. "I want you to come back to my penthouse. I want you to be my son's full-time caregiver. You will have your own rooms, the best food, and more money than you can spend in a lifetime. Just keep him quiet like this." Odette looked at the check, then up at Wuram. She didn't reach for the paper. She didn't even look impressed. Instead, her eyes grew hard and serious. "Is this how you see the world, Mr. Wu?" she asked softly. "You think you can just write a check and own a person's heart?" Wuram frowned. He wasn't used to being told no. "I am offering you a better life. You are living in a shelter. I am offering you an empire. Take the money." Odette gently shifted Jangho, making sure he stayed asleep. She stood up slowly, her height matching his. "I am a mother, not a machine. What I gave your son tonight was not a service. It was a connection. It was love." She pushed his hand away, the check fluttering between them. "Love and care are not for sale. You cannot buy the milk that saved him, and you cannot buy me." Wuram felt a surge of anger, but beneath it was a flicker of respect. No one had ever dared to refuse him. No one had ever told him his money was worthless. "He will start crying again the moment I leave," Wuram argued, his voice low. "You saw what happened. Only you can stop it. Then ask me for help as a person," Odette countered. "Do not try to buy me like a piece of furniture. If I come, it is for the boy, not for your gold. I want safety for my own life and a future for my daughter. But I will not be your property." Wuram looked at the check on the floor and then at the woman who had just defied him. He realized that if he wanted to save his son, he had to play by her rules. For the first time in his life, the King of Seoul had to ask for a favor instead of giving an order. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the penthouse. Odette stepped onto the shiny floors, carrying her daughter, Zara, in a colorful cloth wrap on her back. Behind her, Wuram carried the sleeping Jangho. The apartment was huge and silent. It felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was black, white, or chrome. There were no family photos on the walls, and the air felt cold, even with the heaters running. "This place has no soul," Odette whispered, her voice echoing in the large hallway. Wuram did not argue. He watched as she began to change the space. It started in the kitchen. For years, Wuram had only eaten food delivered in plastic boxes or prepared by silent chefs. Now, the scent of onions, garlic, and rich African spices filled the air. Odette spent the afternoon boiling a thick, savory soup. The steam clouded the windows, hiding the cold city lights outside. In the living room, she turned off the flickering news channels. Instead, she played soft music from her phone. The rhythmic beat of drums and the sound of voices singing in her home language replaced the lonely silence. Even the light in the penthouse seemed to change. Odette draped a vibrant, patterned blanket over the sharp edges of the leather sofa. She placed a few wooden carvings on the glass tables. Jangho was different, too. He no longer spent his days alone in a distant nursery. Odette moved his crib right next to her own bed in the east wing. When he woke up, he didn't scream for hours. He heard the humming of Odette's voice and the jingle of her bracelets. He felt the warmth of a home that was finally alive. Wuram found himself drawn to the kitchen more and more. He stood in the doorway, watching Odette teach Zara how to clap to the music. He saw how Jangho watched her every move with wide, curious eyes. For the first time, Wuram didn't feel like a boss or a king. He felt like a guest in a place that was actually starting to feel like a home. One evening, Odette handed him a wooden bowl filled with the soup she had made. "Sit and eat," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Wuram sat at his expensive marble island and took a bite. The heat of the spices warmed him from the inside out. He looked at Odette, who was busy singing a lullaby to both babies. The glass tower was still high above the city, but it didn't feel so cold anymore. The silence and grief were fading, replaced by the smell of home and the sound of a family beginning to grow. While the penthouse grew warm with the smell of spices, a cold wind was blowing through the dark corners of the city. In a basement room far below the glittering streets, the Mafia council gathered. These were the men who helped Wuram rule, but they did not follow him out of love. They followed him because they were afraid. Sun Min, Wuram's second in command, sat at the head of a long stone table. He was a man with a sharp face and eyes that always seemed to be looking for a way to climb higher. He tossed a folder onto the table. Inside were grainy photos of the black Bentley parked outside the migrant shelter and pictures of Odette entering the glass tower. "Our king has found a new hobby," Sun Min said, his voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "He has brought a stranger into his fortress, a refugee woman and her child." The other men leaned in, whispering. In their world, any sign of kindness was seen as a crack in the armor. They had watched Wuram skip important meetings to stay at home. They had heard that the man who once stayed up planning wars was now staying up to watch a baby sleep. "He is distracted," another council member said, narrowing his eyes. "He used to be a wolf. Now he is acting like a sheep. A man who cares about a woman and a child is a man who can be threatened." Sun Min smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. "A leader who is soft is a danger to us all. If he cares more about that nursery than he does about our business, then he does not deserve the throne. We have worked too hard to let a crying baby ruin our empire." The council began to whisper about a coup. They knew they couldn't beat Wuram in a fair fight, but they didn't have to. They had found his weakness. They realized that to hurt the giant, they just had to target the people he was starting to love. "We wait for the right moment," Sun Ning commanded, his hand closing into a tight fist on the table. "When he thinks he is the safest, that is when we will strike. We will take everything from him, starting with the woman who made him forget who he really is." The wolves had made their plan. While Wuram was learning how to be a father, his oldest friends were becoming his deadliest enemies. The piece in the glass tower was about to be shattered, and the soft spot Wuram had found was exactly where they planned to plunge the knife. The morning light hit the glass walls of the penthouse, but the mood inside was dark. Wuram stood in his office, staring at a stack of legal papers that had arrived an hour ago. The young family, his late wife's relatives, had officially filed for full custody of Jangho. They were wealthy and powerful, and they were telling the court that a man like Wuram was too dangerous to raise a child. Wuram's jaw tightened. He knew what they really wanted. They didn't love Jangho. They wanted to use the boy to take over his businesses. He looked through the glass at the living room, where Odette was sitting on the floor, helping Jangho reach for a soft toy. The sight of them gave him a strange feeling of peace, but it also made him realize how fragile their world was. "They are going to use everything against me," Wuram said, stepping into the room. Odette looked up, her face serious. "What do you mean?" "The Yungs. They are telling the judge that I am a criminal, and that you are just a stranger with no legal right to be here," Wuram explained. "They will point out that your papers are not finished, and that you could be sent away at any time. If you are gone, and I am seen as a threat, they will take him." Odette stood up, holding Jangho close. The thought of being separated from the baby made her heart race. "I won't let them take him. He finally has a home." Wuram took a deep breath. He had spent his life making deals, but this was the most important one he would ever propose. "There is a way to stop them. If we are married, your legal status changes instantly. You become his mother in the eyes of the law. A judge is much less likely to take a baby away from a married couple with a stable home." Odette froze. "A marriage? You want to buy a wife now?" "No," Wuram said quickly, his voice softer than usual. "This is not about money. It is a contract to protect Jangho. It is a shield for you and a shield for him. I will make sure you are safe, and you will give him the family the court says he needs." Odette looked into Wuram's eyes. She saw the fear he was trying to hide, the fear of losing his son. She looked at Jangho, who was chewing on a plastic ring, completely unaware of the war starting around him. She knew Wuram was a dangerous man, but she also knew he was the only father Jangho had. "A contract," she repeated quietly. "For the boy. For the boy," Wuram promised. "Okay," Odette said, her voice strong. "I will do it. But remember, Wuram, a piece of paper might make me your wife, but it does not make me your property. We are doing this as partners." Wuram nodded, feeling a heavy weight lift off his shoulders. The contract was signed in their hearts before it was ever put on paper. They were no longer just a boss and a helper. They were a team ready to fight for their son. The courtroom was cold and smelled of old paper and floor wax. Wuram sat at a long wooden table, his back straight and his face like stone. Next to him, Odette wore a simple but elegant dress, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Across the room, the young family sat with their expensive lawyers, looking at Odette with cold, judgmental eyes. They whispered to each other, acting as if they had already won. "The father is a man of violence," the Jung's lawyer began, his voice booming through the room. And this woman is a stranger with no history in this country. How can this child be safe in such a home? When it was Odette's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the witness stand. She didn't look at the lawyers or the angry faces of the young family. She looked directly at the judge, a stern woman with gray hair who had seen 1,000 cases like this one. "I am not a stranger to Jangho," Odette said, her voice clear and steady. "I am the one who wakes up when he cries at night. I am the one who knows exactly how he likes to be held. When I met him, he was fading away because he was lonely. Now he is strong. He is gaining weight. He is happy." She pulled out a small folder of photos and medical charts. "These are his records from the last month. You can see the change. He doesn't need a boarding school or a group of nannies. He needs the love of the people who are actually there for him every single day." The young lawyer tried to interrupt. "But your marriage is just for show. It happened only days ago." Odette didn't flinch. "A marriage certificate is a piece of paper, but the family we have built is real. Woo-Ram is a man who would move mountains to keep his son safe. I have seen him change. I have seen him learn to be a father. Can these people say they have held Jangho even once in the last 3 months?" The courtroom went silent. The young family looked away, unable to answer. They had all the money in the world, but they didn't have a single memory of holding the boy. The judge looked at the medical reports, and then at the photos of Jangho smiling in Odette's arms. She leaned forward, her expression softening just a little. "The law cares about the best interests of the child," the judge announced, her voice echoing. "Wealth and power do not make a home. Care and stability do. Based on the evidence of the child's dramatic improvement, I am denying the petition for custody. Jangho stays with his father and his stepmother." The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the desk felt like a victory shout. Woo-Ram let out a long breath he had been holding for hours. He turned to Odette, and for the first time in public, he reached out and squeezed her hand. They had won the first battle, but as they walked out of the courtroom, Woo-Ram saw Sunmin watching them from the back of the room. The legal war was over, but the real war was just beginning. The victory from the courtroom felt like a warm blanket, but it did not last long. That night, a heavy silence hung over the city. Inside the penthouse, Odette was in the nursery, softly rocking Jangho. The room was filled with the gentle glow of a small nightlight. Jangho was finally asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The humming sound of the air conditioner stopped, and the glowing city skyline outside the windows went black. The entire penthouse was plunged into a deep, terrifying darkness. Odette froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just a simple power outage. She stood up slowly, pulling Jangho from his crib and tucking him tightly against her chest. She could hear the faint sound of heavy boots walking quickly down the hallway. These were not the footsteps of Woo-Ram's loyal guards. They were too fast and too loud. "Woo-Ram!" she whispered, but there was no answer. A red emergency light began to flash in the hallway, casting long, bloody shadows against the nursery walls. From the living room, she heard the muffled thud of a door being kicked open and the sharp crack of glass shattering. Sunmen had arrived. The wolves were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were inside the fortress. Odette looked at the nursery door. She knew she couldn't run. The penthouse was too high up, and the elevators were dead. She was trapped on the top floor with a baby and a daughter. She remembered the secret magnetic lock Woo-Ram had shown her, a special button hidden behind the door frame that could seal the room like a vault. As the footsteps grew closer, a man's voice echoed through the dark. "Find the woman and the boy," Sun Min commanded. "Without them, Wuram has nothing left to fight for." Odette reached for the hidden button, her fingers trembling. Just as a shadow appeared under the nursery door, she pressed it. A heavy metal bolt slid into place with a loud clack. A second later, the door handle rattled violently. Someone began to pound on the wood, but the door didn't budge. "Open up!" a man shouted from the other side. Odette backed away into the corner of the room, holding Jangho so close she could feel his tiny heart beating against hers. She was alone in the dark, surrounded by men who wanted to destroy her family. But as she listened to the sounds of the siege outside, her fear began to turn into a cold, sharp anger. She had survived a war in her home country and a journey across the sea. She was not going to let these men take her son. The heavy nursery door groaned as the men outside slammed their shoulders against it. Odette stood in the center of the room, her shadow flickering in the red emergency light. Jangho was silent now, as if he understood the danger. He clung to her neck, his small heart racing against hers. In the crib next to her, Zara had woken up, her eyes wide with fear, but her mouth held tight. Odette didn't have a gun. She didn't have an army. But she had the survival skills of a woman who had crossed borders and lived through storms. She quickly pushed the heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. Then, she grabbed a heavy metal floor lamp and unscrewed the base, turning the long pole into a staff. "Stay behind me," she whispered to Zara, moving them both into the walk-in closet. The nursery was a fortress within a fortress. The walls were reinforced with steel, and the glass was thick enough to stop a bullet. But the men outside were desperate. Odette heard the sound of a drill grinding against the lock. They weren't just trying to open the door. They were trying to take her son. "I know you're in there, Odette." Sun Nin's voice drifted through the wood, oily and cold. "Give us the boy, and you and your girl can walk away. Why die for a man who only bought you to be a nurse?" Odette gripped the metal pole until her knuckles turned white. "You don't know anything about why I'm here," she shouted back. "And you will never touch this child." Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the hallway. The floor beneath her feet trembled. She heard the sound of glass breaking and men shouting in pain. The drilling stopped. A new sound filled the air, the sharp, rhythmic beat of a weapon she recognized. It was the sound of Wuram's fury. "He's here," Zara whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Odette didn't relax. She kept her eyes on the door as the sounds of battle moved closer. She heard the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor and the desperate pleas of traitors. Finally, the pounding on the door returned, but this time it was different. It was a rhythmic knock, 3 fast, 2 slow. "Odette, open the door!" Wuram's voice was hoarse and full of panic. She pushed the dresser aside with a strength she didn't know she had and hit the release button. The door swung open. Wuram stood there, his face covered in soot and blood, his eyes wild. When he saw her standing there with the metal pole, shielding both children, he dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. He didn't look at his empire. He didn't look at the dead men in his hallway. He only looked at his family. "You stayed," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I told you," Odette said, her breath finally coming in a sob. "I am a mother. We don't run." Wuram pulled them all into his arms, his tears mixing with the grime on his face. In that moment, the ruthless boss was gone. There was only a man who realized that his real power wasn't in the city he ruled, but in the woman who had turned his nursery into a battlefield to save his soul. The morning sun began to rise over Seoul, turning the sky a soft pink and gold. Inside the broken penthouse, the smoke was clearing. Woo-ram stood by the window, watching the police cars gather in the streets below. Their blue and red lights flashed against the glass. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like running. He didn't feel like fighting. He just felt finished with the darkness. He turned back to the room. Odette was sitting on the floor, holding both children. Her clothes were torn, and her face was tired, but she looked like a queen who had defended her throne. Woo-ram walked over to his desk and pulled out a small, encrypted hard drive. It contained every secret of the Mafia Council, the names, the bank accounts, and the crimes they had committed for decades. It was the key to his empire, and it was also a weapon that could destroy him. "Sudden thought my love for you was a weakness," Woo-ram said, his voice quiet but firm. "He thought it would make me easy to kill. He didn't realize that loving you made me realize I have something worth living for. I don't want to be the king of the underworld anymore." He walked out of the penthouse and met the high-ranking officers at the elevator. Instead of threats or bribes, he simply handed them the hard drive. "This is everything," he told them. "I am turning myself in as a witness. I am dismantling the council. Every business I own that is illegal will be closed today." Word spread through the city like a wildfire. By noon, the news was everywhere. The ruthless Woo-ram was stepping down. He stood before a crowd of reporters outside the police station, with Odette standing bravely by his side. "I have spent my life building an empire of fear," Woo-ram announced to the cameras. "But fear cannot protect a family. From this day on, my name will not be associated with violence. I am choosing a different path. I am choosing the sun." He looked at Odette, and the coldness that had defined his life for years finally melted away. He was giving up his power, his money, and his reputation. In the eyes of the city, he was losing everything. But as he reached out to hold Odette's hand, Woo-ram knew he had finally won. He wasn't a boss anymore. He was a man who was finally free to be a husband and a father. The empire of blood was dead, and in its place, a new life was beginning to grow. 3 years had passed, and the city of Seoul looked different through Woo-ram's eyes. He no longer spent his days in dark rooms planning wars. Instead, he stood on a busy street corner, wearing a yellow hard hat and a simple work vest. The company logo on his chest didn't belong to a secret gang. It belonged to a legitimate construction business that built schools and hospitals. The men working for him were no longer soldiers of the underworld. They were honest workers earning a fair wage. A few blocks away, a bright and colorful building stood where an old warehouse used to be. This was the Jangho Foundation. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of good food. Odette walked through the halls, greeting women from all over the world. Some were refugees looking for safety, and others were single mothers who just needed a helping hand. The foundation provided more than just a place to sleep. It had lawyers to help with paperwork and teachers to help with jobs. Odette had turned her struggle into a map for others to follow. She was no longer a woman hiding in the shadows. She was the heart of a community that refused to let anyone feel invisible. Jangho, now 3 years old, ran through the foundation's playground with Zara. He was a strong, happy boy with a laugh that could light up a room. He didn't remember the cold penthouse or the weeks of crying. He only knew the warmth of his mother's songs and the steady presence of a father who always showed up. That evening, Woo-ram met his family in the garden of the foundation. He watched as Odette helped a young mother settle into her new room. She looked back at him and smiled, her eyes full of the same calm strength that had saved his son years ago. "Look at what we built," Wuram whispered as he pulled her close. We didn't just build a building, Wuram. Odette corrected him softly. We built a future. Wuram looked up at the sky. The glass towers of the city still glittered in the distance, but he didn't miss his old life. He had traded a throne of fear for a home full of love. He had been a man who controlled everything but owned nothing. Now, he was a man who had given up everything to finally have what truly mattered. The family that was brought together by a baby's cry was now the light that helped hundreds of others find their way home. The empire of blood was gone, and the empire of love had truly taken its place.